So we finally arrive at the much awaited internal assessment, although way off our initial schedule to complete it in DP1. In this video, I will be going over the requirements of the internal assessment and how to get your planning and proposal form started. So the psychology internal assessment, in a nutshell, is a lab just like you would conduct in a science class. Learning how to plan, propose, and conduct a primary research is an important skill moving forward. It is not only relevant to psychology but other fields too. More and more programs are focusing on a scientist practitioner approach, which requires professionals to stay up to date with research and also conduct their own research. For the internal assessment, you will choose a research that has already been conducted and published to replicate or modify. For example, Loftus and Palmer's research on post-event information or misinformation and how that influences the reliability of memory. You will plan out your experiment with your groups, decide on the variables, the research design, sample, materials, and procedure. You will then go on to conduct the experiment in school and collect data which will be statistically analyzed to test for your hypotheses. You will then individually write a report which is to be 1800 to 2200 words. And your report will be divided into 4 sections, which is your introduction for 6 points, exploration for 4 points, analysis for 6 points, and evaluation for 6 points. I will go over each component in a later video. Just to highlight the main assessment breakdown, for SLs, the IA is 25% of your final grade, and for HLs, 20% of your final grade. The IA is one component that you have most control over because you get to work on it over time and also receive feedback from your teacher. In the past, students who scored a 4 in their external assessment papers but had a 6 in their internal assessment papers were able to make an overall grade of 5. So it's a good idea to put in your best effort to meet all the requirements of the IA. So some of the main requirements of the IA are that the research has to be experimental. So we have to manipulate the independent variable and dependent variable in a controlled environment with the purpose of testing for a cause-effect relationship. So you cannot have correlational researches, you cannot have quasi-experiments because that is not going to allow you to manipulate the variables as expected by the IB for this project or this assessment. You're required to work in groups of 2 to 4 people, no more or no less than that. All members from the group are expected to be involved in the planning and conduction of the research, but the report itself will be an independent report, so that you will have to work on your own and write in your own words. As all psychological research, this research also needs to be in line with all ethical standards that is expected. The IB has no tolerance for ethical breaches. This is considered academic misconduct and can also mean that you don't receive your diploma as a whole. So please make sure that all ethical guidelines are followed. As for the don'ts of the IA, there are quite a few things that you need to keep in mind. There cannot be any studies of obedience and conformity, such as the Stanford Prison Experiment and Ash's research on conformity. The variables cannot involve any ingestion or inhalation of substances. There will be no placebos being administered. There will be no research conducted on animals. And like I mentioned earlier, the research has to be experimental in nature. So conducting research to investigate the difference between age, gender, and culture that are innate to the participants is out of the picture. No children below the age of 12 are to be recruited and sampled for your research. And if the participant is below the age of 16, parental consent needs to be ensured. So the timeline that we will be following, this is part of the timeline that we will be following. The rest is available on OneNote. The first week, which is this week, is for you to finalize your choice of experiment and get it approved by me. Following which you will work on your planning and proposal form on OneNote. You will get time during class to do this, but this needs to be completed before you break for the summer because over the break you will work on your introduction and explorations individually. When we return from the summer break, the first step would be for you to recruit participants for your research. From the 17th to 18th August, you will work on finalizing your procedure and materials for the experiment. You will present your procedure to your classmates for peer feedback before you go on to actually conducting the research. And at the end of the week, on the 23rd of August, your first draft for your introduction and exploration will be due. So what you're going to work on before the summer break is your planning and proposal form. You have worked on multiple practice proposal forms throughout the year, so this is not something that is completely new and alien to you. In the proposal form, you will have to identify an original research that you're going to replicate or modify. You will outline its aims, procedures, and findings and connect it to a model or theory that research is based on. So for Loftus and Palmer's research, the theory can be schema theory and reconstructive memory. And the link would be that schemas, in this case, the varying degrees of verbs used and their connotations, and how that influences the estimation of speed and whether the participants saw broken glass in the accident video. A lot of researchers have multiple variables, so you will have to discuss which one independent variable and dependent variable that you and your group will be focusing on to test. And if there are any other modifications you will be making, such as adding a distraction task, you will also justify why you're making these changes. As usual, you will then outline the aim, variables, hypotheses, relevance of your research, research design, sampling method, and so on, as you have in all of your other research proposals. You will also draft the research procedure step by step, and this needs to be put in a way that anyone reading your procedure should be able to replicate your experiment seamlessly. Okay? And finally, how will you be meeting the ethical considerations of conducting research? And if there are any particular issues as part of that research in particular that you need to keep an eye out for, and how you can ensure that it does not affect the participants. So the first thing that you need to consider is your conditions. Like I said before, a lot of researchers have multiple independent variables and multiple dependent variables. For this project or this assessment, you need to choose only one independent variable and one dependent variable. And it is advisable for you to have two conditions because it is easier for you to statistically analyze that, either using a Mann-Whitney U, a t-test, or Wilcoxon's test, okay? So you can administer your conditions either as an independent measures design, which would be having two different groups of participants, each of which will receive a different condition. And this design would help you avoid order and practice effects and also potential demand characteristics. The other option is to conduct it in a repeated measures design, which would involve one group of participants who are exposed to both conditions of your research. This would help control for individual differences, and it can be counterbalanced to avoid order effects. For an independent measures design, it would be advisable for you to have about 30 participants because you can have at least 15 in each group, and can, in case of outliers, reduce a few of the data sets or results. And having a minimum of 10 in each group is advisable because otherwise the statistical analysis will not be valid and reliable. And for a repeated measures design, a total of 20 participants who go through both the conditions would be a good idea as well. Your sampling method is likely to be either availability or volunteer sampling, and you have to decide your choice of participants. Yes, we don't have a lot of option, but within our school population, who are you going to include and who are you going to exclude and why? Going back to Loftus and Palmer, the inclusion criteria could be students above the age of 16. First, this would mean that they would be able to consent for their own participation. And also, Being 16, participants are likely to have a learner's license. At least this would be the case in India. And this would help prevent knowledge of driving or automobiles from being a confounding variable. And an exclusion criteria could be anyone that has had a past experience or has witnessed a road accident. This choice would be for ethical reasons so that we don't bring out any traumatic memories or cause any discomfort in the participants. So, even though we are looking at a limited population of our high school, there are factors that you can consider for inclusion and exclusion. Okay? There are likely to be some extraneous variables which may affect the internal validity of your research. So you have to identify and devise a plan for how you are going to control possible extraneous variables. For example, the recency effect may be an extraneous variable to your investigation of levels of processing and whether deep processing results in better encoding into the LTM. So by adding a 30-second distraction task, as you have seen in Glanzer and Kunetz's research, you can control for the recency effect. So basically, you will have to look at possible extraneous variables that you think might affect your results or your variables and how they interact with one another, and try putting together a variable to control for that, okay? You will then decide the materials and your choice to use that material. This doesn't mean you need to explain why you're using a pen and paper, but materials like car crash videos, the choice of word list, questions, or distraction tasks. Are you using the same car crash video as Loftus and Palmer to ensure standardization of your process or of your procedure? Or are you choosing a more recent car crash video which has a right-handed or right-sided driving and it reflects the traffic flow in your country, okay? So you need to justify the materials that you're choosing. Finally, for your hypotheses, you need to state both a null hypothesis and a research hypothesis that is fully operationalized. Operationalization is basically defining your variables in your hypotheses as it is going to be measured in your research. Motivation, for example, can be measured in several different ways. Okay, so how are you in your research going to define motivation, and how are you going to measure motivation? So that is what your operationalization is going to look like. An example of that would be the research hypothesis is that participants in the smashed condition will estimate higher speed in kilometers per hour than the participants in the collided condition. The leading verb is the independent variable, namely smashed and collided, and the dependent variable is the estimation of speed. So this is an example of an operationalized hypothesis, and this is the research hypothesis. The null hypothesis would say that there is going to be no difference. Yeah, and this is also an example of a one-tailed hypothesis which has directionality. You are hypothesizing in a one-tailed hypothesis that one condition will have significantly higher estimation of speed from the other condition. You can choose to test your hypotheses as one-tailed if there is little chance of there being the opposite effect. For example, collided having higher estimation of speed. This could be possible in participants who aren't able to understand the difference in the verbs and their connotation. Maybe someone or a group of participants who have just started to learn English. Okay, so you can consider for that. And in that case, you can go for a two-tailed hypothesis, which is basically stating that there will be a significant difference between the two conditions. You wouldn't be saying which is going to be more than the other, but just stating that there will be a difference. Okay? So this is the main run through for the requirements of the IA and what you're going to need to do for your planning and proposal form, which is on OneNote. This also explains a lot of what is expected of you for introduction and exploration. Okay, I will go over introduction and exploration individually in the next session, which will be next Wednesday on the 10th of June. We will now meet on Zoom to have your group discuss the research you would like to replicate and to get started on your planning and proposal form on OneNote.